Hi everybody, I hope that you're all doing really well. So today I am back to do the Contradictions Book Tag. This was created by Daniela over at Only If for a Page and is a tag that's dedicated to all of the times that our bookish opinions don't quite line up with our taste. The times where a book should hit the spot but doesn't, or the times where you absolutely would not usually like a book and somehow you do. I'm definitely a human who is a massive contradiction, so I thought I would be perfect for this tag. Question number one is, I love this genre but didn't love this book. And for me, the book that springs to mind when I think of this is Longbourn by Jo Baker, because not only is this historical fiction, which yes, I do tend to have an up and down relationship with, but usually I am on the side of yes, I like this, but it's also a Jane Austen retelling. Not only a Jane Austen retelling, but a Pride and Prejudice retelling. I love Pride and Prejudice and I've gotten on very well with other Pride and Prejudice retellings in the past. I should have loved this book, and yet unfortunately you might remember it was the very first 1 star of my channel. I will leave down below the wrap up where I talk about this in more detail, but yeah, I just did not get on with this book. It's the tale of Pride and Prejudice but told by the servants at Longbourn, and I think that is such an interesting concept for a retelling of Pride and Prejudice. And actually I felt like the first chapter captured this thesis like brilliantly. Had that first chapter just been a short story, I feel like the point of the entire book could have been gotten across very, very well and efficiently. But no, the book just continued, and I feel like my main gripe with this book was that it just felt like a complete distortion of the characters of Pride and Prejudice. Like, they just didn't act the way that I feel they would. Either that or they were completely like simplified, caricatured versions of themselves in Pride and Prejudice. No me gusta, no me gusta. Question number 2, I rarely read this genre, but I loved this book. And I was trying to think of different genres that I don't tend to read very often. And for me, the kind of things that I don't pick up all that often are typical genre books. So things like sci-fi, fantasy, any non-fiction that is remotely to do with like maths or science, I just steer way, way away from. I'm a literature and humanities girl, I am not a science girl. And yet a book that I absolutely love, was 5 stars, and I want to thrust into the hands of everybody that I can, is Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker, which is a science non-fiction. This is a book that is all about the importance of sleep, the science of sleep, the health benefits of sleep, and the detriments of not getting enough sleep. From the first page, this book terrified me, and I think that was only a good thing. I cannot believe that a sciencey book kept my interest for the entire thing, but it did. And it's one that I just think is crucial and everybody should read, and especially every manager who likes to schedule night shifts for their workers. Question number 3 is, I love this trope, but I didn't like this book. For both question 3 and 4, they talk about tropes, and yeah, I'm really going to stretch the definition of trope, and instead of that, I'm going to talk about like settings or things that are included in books, rather than what I think a lot of people would think of as a trope, like enemies to lovers or a particular plot beat. And for me, a premise for a book that I really tend to love is female-focused Greek myth retellings. Greek myth retellings in general, but I do always love it when there is a female focus. And one that I'm sure you will all know I was so excited to read and yet really didn't live up to the hype for me was Ariadne by Jennifer Saint. Maybe I'm most heartbroken by this because the cover was so beautiful, and I just expect that beautiful covers will yield a beautiful plot, and yet no. This is a book that is a retelling of the myth of Theseus and the Minotaur, but from the perspective of Ariadne, who is actually the half-sister of the Minotaur, but who fell in love with Theseus and helped him to escape. I just found the pacing of this book so off. It was very, very fast right at the beginning of the book. You kind of speed through like the key plot that you're expecting, and then suddenly it just grinds to a halt. I didn't much care for the writing style, and yeah, unfortunately a bit of a disappointment to me. Question number 4, conversely, is I hate this trope, but I love this book. Once again, I'm not really going for a trope here, more for a setting. And for me personally, a setting that doesn't typically work for me is kind of like the 1960s, 1970s like pop rock scene. I know so many people love the 1960s and the 70s music scene. They love books that really capture that sex, drugs and rock and roll lifestyle, and I don't know what it is. It has never appealed to me. I hear so many people being like, oh, I'd love to live back then. Wouldn't it be so cool if you were transported back then? And I'm like, okay. I honestly couldn't think of a setting that I would less like to go to. But you know, I am willing to admit that that's probably just a sign of me being supremely boring. I don't know what to tell you. But you know what? Despite the fact that I don't typically like the 1970s music scene for a book, I really, really enjoyed Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid, which recounts the lives of the different members of this fictional band. It's told in kind of like a documentary form with snippets of interviews from the different band members, all blended together to create this one narrative. And you get to see this band's rise and then eventual fall and breakup. And I just thought it was fantastically done. I think Taylor Jenkins Reid is really, really fantastic at writing about fame and the effects of fame, particularly on relationships to friends and family. Whilst I do think that The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo is more my kind of thing, I still feel like Daisy Jones and the Six was a brilliant book, even though when I originally heard of the premise and the setting, it did initially put me off. I am happy to be wrong in this instance. Question number 5 is, I love this author but didn't like this book. This is one that I kind of struggled with, because there have definitely been authors where I really liked the first book that I read by them, but then wasn't really blown away by their second. I've had that with authors like Mina Kandasamy, where I absolutely loved When I Hit You, but then the second book I read by her, Exquisite cadavers, I was just like, eh. I also thought about Charlotte Bronte, where I absolutely love the Brontes, but I will admit that there are definitely books by the Brontes that I like more than others. For example, with Charlotte Bronte, I absolutely love Jane Eyre. I think it's one of the best books ever written. But then I read Philette and it was kind of to me. But you know, still pretty good. I think if I'm going to give this to anybody, I'll probably give it to Markus Zusak, because one of my favourite books of all time is The Book Thief. I then read I Am the Messenger and I quite liked that book, but then I read his most recent book, Bridge of Clay, and I DNF'd that after 50 pages. I just couldn't stand it. And that was definitely a disappointment to me, and now it makes me kind of anxious to pick anything else up by him. Was The Book Thief just a fluke? Question number 6 is, I previously disliked a book by this author, but I loved this book. And once again, I kind of struggled with this question, because to be honest with you, if the first time I pick up a book by an author, I don't like the book, I'm gonna be really hesitant to read another thing by them. And it's gonna be really shocking to me if I pick up the second book and end up loving it. An answer did come to me, but even then I would say that this is a little bit of a cheat, because after I read this second book and loved it, I went back to the first one that I read and not liked and ended up loving it on a reread. And the answer to this question is Elizabeth Gaskell, because I originally read North and South back in 2019 and didn't really like it. Absolutely shocking, I know. But then come last Victober, I went back and I read Wives and Daughters, which is another one of her famous works. And I adored Wives and Daughters. I thought it was so good. This brilliant story about family dynamics and how they change over time. And I was kind of surprised that I could have disliked North and South so much but loved Wives and Daughters. And because it was October, I went back, I found an audiobook of North and South and I listened to it, and I realised that I was utterly wrong. I really loved North and South on a reread, and that's just kind of baffling to me that I could have been so incredibly wrong. So I don't know how much Wives and Daughters fits for this question, considering I was able to go back and love North and South. But you know, everything in me said that I probably wasn't going to like Wives and Daughters because I hadn't liked North and South the first time. And now I love them both, and Elizabeth Gaskell is now one of my favourite authors. I'm not gonna lie to you, I don't like being wrong. Question number 7 is, I love this cover but I didn't like this book. And my goodness, there are so many books that this could apply to. I am very easily swayed by a pretty cover, especially if it has any sort of foiling. I am such a sucker for that. Of course, we could go back to Ariadne. That was definitely a book where the cover seduced me. The one that really pops to mind for me, where I was purely motivated to pick this book by the cover, not even by the plot of it, was 3 Things About Elsie by Joanna Canon. I knew very little about this book aside from the fact that the cover was Battenberg, and I was so intrigued by that. Like, does this cover not just look like the most scrumptious thing you've ever seen? And I was just intrigued. I wanted to know what this Battenberg book was about. That was a lot of B's. Battenberg book was about. It's set kind of in a care home sheltered accommodation where 84-year-old Florence is trying to unravel this mystery of this new resident that has entered her care home. She often refers to her best friend Elsie, and through the story we're kind of unraveling what is true and what is false, how much of what Florence is telling us is real and how much of it is a result of memory loss and dementia. But unfortunately, I just kind of found this story a bit boring. There was a twist at the end and I ended up guessing it, and it just kind of felt very run-of-the-mill to me. And one of the reasons that I ended up guessing the twist was because I had previously read Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine, and the twist in both books is pretty similar. So yeah, I just found 3 Things About Elsie a little bit stale. Stale Battenberg. How unfortunate. The last question, number 8, is, I don't like this cover, but I loved this book. Once again, quite a hard question for me, because I will admit that I am quite a shallow book buyer. I do tend to go out of my way to try and find the prettiest edition of the books that I tend to read. But the one that I eventually came up with for this question was English Animals by Laura Kay. This is a really fascinating book that I wasn't really expecting to like it as much as I did. It's a book that is about marriage and immigration and taxidermy, like so many different things I didn't think I would be interested in. It's very slow paced, it's kind of relationships focused, which we know I love. But then I look at this cover and I just think, it's not the worst thing that I've ever seen, but I feel like it could be better. To me, it just feels like somebody Googled image of a fox and then slapped text on it. It's just a bit dull to me, to be honest. I feel like I'd much prefer for this to have a cover kind of like The Animals of Lockwood Manor or any of Stacey Hall's books. I feel like this is the book that deserves that beautiful cover. Whereas these books that do have beautiful covers, I end up not liking the book. Like, it's not fair. And then finally, question number 9 is tag somebody. I don't know by the time this video goes out who will have already done this tag. So if you want to, definitely do and say that I tagged you. For now, I think I will tag Leanne Rose, Sylvie from the TBR Diaries, and Anna from Read to Me at Midnight. Do let me know about any bookish contradictions of your own. I'd love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye!